Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Putin's Wars and NATO's Flaws. Why Russia Invaded Ukraine, by Paul Moorcraft. Narrated by Mike Cooper. Chapter 1. Are Russians Different? Are Russians different from other Europeans is a question that is often asked. It is, of course, a racist question, like Afrikaners during apartheid arguing that blacks were different, but it is clear that Russians have enjoyed or suffered under different influences from most Western European countries. First, the distinctive terrain is important. Russia is situated on more than one continent. The country spans the northern part of the Eurasian continent. 77% is in Asia. The western 23% of the country is located in Europe. European Russia occupies almost 40% of the total area of Europe. The specific traits of Russia's natural environment have been often unproductive soil, a short growing season, an abundance of land and a small population. Distance from navigable seas and usually arduous land travel were the main features distinguishing Russia from Western Europe. Russia contains Europe's longest river, the Volga, and its largest lake, Ladoga. Russia is also home to the world's deepest lake, Baikal, and the country has recorded the world's lowest temperature outside the North and South Poles. Geography is of vital influence because the country has few natural defensive barriers. The flat plains have invited centuries of invasions. It is often forgotten today that the Red Army was largely responsible for the destruction of the Wehrmacht. Tens of millions of Russian civilians and soldiers died in the Second World War. That is why, in Russia, security trumps all. So, Russians have good reasons to be paranoid about foreigners, and the burden of history is part of the famous Russian mood swings, from bloated patriotism to debilitating pessimism. The inhabitants of Russia are quite diverse. It has many languages and cultures, although Russian is often the common language. It is often said that Russia has an unpredictable past. The origin myths are frequently juggled, just as Putin is now doing with the origins of Ukraine, Little Russia, as an intrinsic part of Russia, just as Belarus, White Russia, is said to be. All belong to the same great nation, argued Putin. All were part of one Russia led by the great Russians. Russians often talk about the Asiatic stuff and blame the Mongol yoke. They often relate the Russian style of ruthless dictatorship to the heritage of Mongol rule. The Mongols ruled for only 250 years, and nobody would say that the Spaniards are not Europeans because they were ruled by Muslims for much longer. Geography and foreign occupation are obviously important factors, as was the religious and cultural influence of Byzantium. The country's poverty is often noted, as is the country's feudal system, but it is also important to remember that the serfs were liberated in 1861, 4 years before the slaves were freed in the USA. The Russians were often looked down on by Europeans in the period before the 1917 revolution. They were considered Asiatic others, barbarians. Russian intellectuals tended to divide into two camps on this matter, Westerners and Slavophiles. In 1881, Leo Tolstoy wrote, "In Europe we were hangers-on and slaves, while in Asia we shall be masters. In Europe we were Tatars, while in Asia we can be Europeans." In the 19th century, Russia became an accepted part of grand European politics, partly because of its military strength, though military inadequacies prompted the disasters of 1905 and then the revolutions in 1917. The creation of the Soviet Union, however, led to a self-imposed isolation from the Western world. This was to create, as Sheila Fitzpatrick explained, a kind of aggressive cultural insularity conveyed through the Soviet trademark combination of boastfulness and a sense of inferiority in dealing with the West. Russians tend to believe that the West is interested only in the ugly things that happened in the USSR. Yes, there were lots of ugly things, from the Great Purges and the Gulags to the catastrophe of Chernobyl. The West tends to focus on negative things, but also acknowledges the towering intellectual achievements of Russia in the worlds of music, ballet and literature, for example. And perhaps the Russians do have something when they talk about their soulfulness compared with the shallow materialism of the West. The claim that all classes can sit in a cafe and discuss, say, Pushkin has some validity. Most Russians believe they have much better family and social values than the West and look down on same-sex marriages, for example. The 1917 revolution did inspire genuine idealism, and the almost messianic zeal of world socialism was not simply Communist Party propaganda. Stalin's forced industrialization and agricultural collectivization, especially in Ukraine, caused much suffering but did allow the Soviet Union to resist the Nazi invasion. And it did help the USSR to compete at some levels with the rival American superpower during the First Cold War. The USSR did create an effective welfare state. The life expectancy, 67, of Soviet citizens at the end of the Soviet era was almost twice that of those born at its beginning. Many of the older generation remembered the egalitarian values of the USSR and that the brief experiments with capitalism after 1990 led to suffering and even starvation. The commander of the Northern Fleet had to ask Norwegians to supply his men with food, while in the big cities pensioners were often forced to sell off their last prized possessions. Mikhail Gorbachev had planned to save the USSR from itself, but he had no plans to dismember the Union. The collapse was sudden and unexpected, even for the most competent of Western Kremlinologists, as the Russian-born American anthropologist Professor Alexei Yurchak's work on the USSR described it in the title of his famous book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. How could a superpower with the most nukes in the world, with a very powerful massive army and state security system, and with 20 million Communist Party members, suddenly commit suicide without a shot being fired in its defense? Suddenly, the pre-Soviet past was all many Russians could hold on to. The old two-headed imperial eagle returned as a state symbol. Many Russians believed that the end of the Cold War was a common victory, not a humbling defeat, and did not deserve American hubris. Boris Yeltsin's foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, was attacked in Russia for giving away too much to the West. He said to Americans, "It's bad enough having you people tell us what you're going to do, whether we like it or not. Don't add insult to injury by also telling us that it's in our best interests to obey your orders." And thus, the overmighty America helped to create the dictatorship led by Putin. In March 2022, he closed down the last independent newspaper in Russia, Novaya Gazeta. But there is more to Russian revanchism than just Putin's desire to restore the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church, rebuild the armed forces, and take back Russian speakers in Ukraine and Georgia, and possibly in the Baltic states. Alexander Dugin. Putin was never much of an intellectual, though he is an avid, if sometimes misguided, student of Russian history. Putin's brain, as he is often dubbed, is Alexander Dugin, a political philosopher who is sometimes described as a neo-fascist. Born in 1962, he left higher education without qualifications and for a while worked as a street cleaner. Like Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was for a while a hot dog salesman, Dugin prospered because of his connection with Putin, though some analysts suggest that Dugin's influence has been exaggerated. Western experts such as Mark Galeotti attacked the idea of Dugin as a latter-day Rasputin and said the philosopher had very little influence on Putin's politics. Other writers suggest that he was influential, but in a more indirect way, because he expressed clearly the post-Soviet angst and identified the forces of disorientation and resentment that helped to fuel Putin's actions. Dugin, however, may well have had far more influence with the Russian separatists in Ukraine. Dugin published an influential book in 1997 called Foundation of Geopolitics. It was described by some US critics as being the source of Russia's manifest destiny. Essentially, he wanted to create a new Euro-Asian empire that could challenge the US-led Western world. Dugin did try to start up a number of political parties, but he has achieved fame as a public intellectual who has praised Putin to the skies. Putin is everything, Putin is absolute, and Putin is indispensable. Dugin published a number of tracts on why Russian Renaissance could come only if Ukraine were defeated. He advocated the annexation of Crimea and then the intervention in the Donbass. Dugin could be considered as an intellectual leader of the so-called war party in the Kremlin. His daughter, Daria Dugina, was killed in a car bombing in Moscow on the 20th of August 2022. Ukrainians were blamed, but Dugin switched cars at the last minute, so he may well have been the target, not his daughter. Mikhail Shishkin. Shishkin is the most prominent novelist of his generation, though he's lived in exile in Switzerland for 18 years. He has a Russian father and Ukrainian mother and is an outspoken critic of Putin, especially his war in Ukraine. In his book, Russia, War or Peace, published in 2023, he explains that many people in the USA and Western Europe assumed that when communism collapsed, capitalism and an open society would return. Shishkin argued that this idea is a complete misconception. They did not understand how deep-rooted unfreedom is. It is intrinsic to his homeland and always has been. He traced Russian history from the Mongols all the way to the Siloviki, the men of power, force under Putin. The bosses, or boss, have always ruled. Nobody believed they were really free. Even under the dictatorship of the proletariat, individuals were the property of the state. The cult of personality around the leader, the vozhd, has remained the same. Russia is not littered by statues of Putin, as happened with Stalin. The cult of Putin is, however, pervasive. Nor have Westerners understood Russian economic history. The country has never had proper laws of ownership. Even today's oligarchs don't have real freedom. The state is still in control, and they know that men in uniforms can come and take their palace or boats away from them. That is one reason why the mega-rich oligarchs stashed so much money abroad. As Shishkin puts it, today you're an oligarch, tomorrow you'll be lying in a cot in a prison cell. The exceptions to authoritarianism were few. In 1917, the Bolsheviks permitted a democratic parliament to exist for 13 hours before closing it down for the next 70 years. Then, after 1991, there was a brief period when anything seemed possible, but the instability led to a yearning for a new leader to take control. Retaking Ukraine is the beginning, not the end, of Russia's rise to greatness again, according to Putin, says the novelist. Shishkin wrote, "In Putin's Russia, it's impossible to breathe. The stench from the policeman's boot is too strong." It is almost impossible to generalize about Russia because it is so varied. Moscow can be a vibrant capital like New York or London, and the Federation spans so many times from frozen Archangel to steamy Sochi. Yes, Russians exhibit strong discipline and also chronic drunkenness. It's partly a problem of perception. Westerners, particularly the British, tend to think of Bond villains, or more recently the kind of mafia-type bosses in the popular John Wick series of films. Britain has produced a series of films and plays about the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London and the Salisbury poisoning of a defector and his daughter, Sergei and Yulia Skripal. All this makes Russia, especially its government, and especially after the atrocities in Ukraine, as akin to Mordor. Maybe Britain and Russia are more alike, however, than they like to think. They're both bookends of Europe and have lost their empires, but have forgotten how to be mere countries. Chapter 2. Understanding Russia. Why Putin invaded Ukraine. The most important factor in any war is to understand your enemy. Russian history can reflect nearly all the sweeping interpretations of how nations behave. It depends, however, partly on where you are standing, in snowbound and besieged Moscow, or Washington, D.C. on a balmy Sunday when the cherry blossoms are in season, for example. Is ideology important? Yes, because once upon a time communism was going to sweep the world. The great man theory has validity too, or in the case of Catherine the Great Woman theory. Sometimes they might coalesce, as in Vladimir Lenin's secret journey to Petrograd's Finland station, kindly arranged by the scheming Germans because the goateed Russian revolutionary called for immediate peace with Berlin. An even older historical tradition maintains that geography shapes politics, hence geopolitics. Russia is vast, the biggest country in the world, and much of it is inaccessible and frozen. In particular, Imperial Russia suffered because of its lack of a warm-water port. Old-fashioned thinking, maybe, but still relevant today. To the west, the Russian bear is often perceived as ferocious when not hibernating. The bear is an apt symbol of Russia, majestic yet unpredictable when woken up. From the bear's perspective, the west has usually been aggressive. The massive barrier of Siberia in the east has protected that flank, but the North European plain has afforded a convenient invasion route for the Poles, the Swedes, the French under Napoleon, and the German army, twice. Just as one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, so too Russia's defensiveness, based on hard experience, may be perceived by an American general as instinctive aggression. The British Army tried to teach its new officers to understand the action-reaction cycle of modern warfare. In 1972, Peter Vigor helped to set up the Soviet Studies Research Centre at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Based on his own experiences of Russians in the Second World War, Peter would deliver a lecture as if he were addressing Soviet officer cadets at the famous Frunze Military Academy in Moscow. He would talk about the mass Russian casualties of both world wars, the abiding fear that the Western Allies would forge a separate peace with the Germans. Peter would throw in the acute humiliation of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that Berlin imposed in 1918. A reminder that the intervention in the Russian Civil War was an attempt to strangle the Bolshevik Revolution at birth would follow. Russians could be trusted, said Commissar Peter. Stalin kept his word to Churchill by staying out of the civil war in Greece, and the Politburo pulled out of Austria, as Stalin had promised before he died. Stalin also kept his promise to attack Japan within 3 months of the end of the war in Europe. Nevertheless, the West helped the fascist West Germans to rearm. The Moscow-led Warsaw Pact was established 6 years after the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded, and only when West Germany had joined the American-dominated alliance. The CIA stirred up all sorts of revolts and sedition in peaceful Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the imperialists waged war on many progressive Soviet allies throughout South America, Africa, and Asia. Regarding Cuba, it was only Soviet good sense that prevented an all-out nuclear exchange in 1962. Peter Vigor's chilling ventriloquism lasted till the early 1980s. A latter-day Vigor would say that Moscow showed great restraint when the First Cold War collapsed. Force was not used anywhere, though Soviet-Russian intelligence played a part in setting up a popular front in Romania after the gory death of one of the nastiest of the dictators, Nicolae Ceausescu. Even in the heartland of the previous World War, the Soviets withdrew from East Germany on the understanding that it would not be absorbed into NATO. They insisted that the Americans promised that the newly enfranchised countries of the Warsaw Pact would not join NATO. They all did, as did the Baltic states, which had been part of the USSR. Moscow was encircled by enemy troops. As Russian generals used to say, NATO forces in Estonia are just a short bus ride, 100 miles, from St. Petersburg. In the West, it is often forgotten that the Red Army did most of the heavy lifting in destroying Adolf Hitler, losing 20 million of its combatants and civilians in the process. Stalin saved Britain from likely defeat. The general view among Russians is that their motherland has rescued Europe from barbarism and enslavement many times, from the Mongols, Napoleon and Hitler in the past, and from the Islamic State and other bloodthirsty jihadists more recently. It was only Vladimir Putin who shook the tree in Syria and kick-started the beginning of the end for the head-choppers in the so-called Caliphate. The Soviet Union, however, turned out indeed to be Upper Volta with nukes, a vast Potemkin village. Lenin and co. prophesied that Western capitalism would collapse because of its own internal contradictions, yet the USSR imploded instead. Few Sovietologists in the West saw it coming, perhaps because of constant misperceptions of the Russians themselves, made more opaque by the generally closed nature of their society. It is true that Vladimir Putin had dramatically increased the defence budget, but Russian military spending had been, on average, 1/10 of NATO's, while their economy was 1/20th, smaller than Brazil, Italy or Canada. Maybe the West should have been nicer to the bankrupt, forlorn country when it disintegrated under the drunken leadership of Boris Yeltsin. Although Russian membership of NATO was discussed, no strategic plan crystallized to bring Moscow in from the cold. Whether Russia, especially under an early Putin, would ever have joined is a moot point. Washington did not offer any kind of Marshall Plan Mark II or praise the country for its bloodless revolution. Instead, Moscow was smothered by a blanket of American hubristic triumphalism. The Americans sent earnest if naive young graduates from the Harvard Business School and the like to teach the poor, benighted Russians how to privatize their industries and how to embrace the glories of capitalism. The rise of Putin. How did the sense of closure, even the alleged end of history in the early 1990s, become Cold War Mark II, possibly more dangerous than the first version? Putin's Russia meant a reversion to type, one-man rule, the personalization of politics. The once oligarch Boris Berezovsky, who knew Putin well, said, The Russian regime has no ideology, no party, no politics. It is nothing but the power of a single man. More liberal Russians, however, had begun to think of themselves increasingly as Europeans, rather than citizens of a highly personalized kleptocracy. Putin had no belief system or civilian project to offer his people beyond revived military strength, beefed up with old-time nationalism and religious orthodoxy. This is what Stalin had done when the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow. Yet even the fearsome Stalin had men like Marshal Georgy Zhukov who could temper his monomania. Putin did not have a Politburo. He ruled alone. Putin was uniquely unilateral. Wealthy Russians rushed to buy up smart apartments in London, while their homeland retreated into a fortress Russia, partly as a result of Putin's military adventures. Disputed parts of Georgia were recaptured from the Georgian army in 2008. Opponents of Putin compared this with Hitler's march into the Rhineland in the 1930s. The highly efficient grab of the Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine were the equivalent of Hitler's seizure of the Sudetenland. Or perhaps the comparison could be made with Britain protecting the Falkland Islanders in 1982, except that in Ukraine the compatriots were next door. It was conjectured in the West that the final move into the Baltic states would parallel the Nazi invasion of Poland that triggered the Second World War. Western sanctions were imposed on Russia, which increasingly looked east, not just to China, but to forge a Eurasian customs union with some of the former Soviet republics. The Eurasian Economic Union, EEU, was officially launched on the 1st of January 1915. Meanwhile, Moscow deployed its hybrid warfare, a clever mix of force and deception called maskirovka. The Western penetration of Ukraine, encouraging membership of the EU and especially NATO, was a provocation too far to the new breed of nationalists ruling in the Kremlin. Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, had been the historic embryo of the Russian soul. That was the romantic side. More practically, the industrial regions of Ukraine contained crucial defense production facilities. Ukraine itself was an artificial construct, created by various border changes, 1922 to 54, that pushed the country hundreds of miles further west. It did, however, gain more territory than it lost, especially to the Russian Federation in the east. After what Putin described as a fascist coup in Ukraine, Russian intelligence stirred up insurgency in the areas heavily populated by ethnic Russians. Putin's tactics were infiltration with soldiers, usually special forces in non-Russian uniforms, nicknamed Little Green Men, plus loads of weapons, including the Buk anti-aircraft system that almost certainly shot down the civilian Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. Always denying responsibility for the fighting in Ukraine with a straight face left Western governments unsure how to respond. Sending in too many weapons and trainers to the pro-Western government in Kiev might have provoked a more overt occupation in eastern Ukraine, thus establishing a land bridge with the Crimean Peninsula. Russia had the Crimean naval base of Sevastopol, formerly on lease, now part of Russia proper, and finally complete control of a warm water port, though there were restrictions on military vessels passing through the Ankara-controlled Turkish Straits. If Ukraine could secede from the USSR, why can't Crimea secede from Ukraine, was Putin's logic. The collapse of the USSR and the subsequent First War in Chechnya had demonstrated the operational deterioration of the Russian armed forces. The savage fighting against the Islamist and national causes in the Caucasus displayed the brutality and indiscipline of the ordinary Russian infantry, though the elite forces did better. In 1999, Moscow dramatically sent an armoured column to block Pristina Airport as NATO forces moved into Kosovo. This author happened to be with the British forces that first encountered them. The American General Wesley Clark had ordered the advancing Brits to destroy the column, but British General Mike Jackson refused, saying that, "I am not about to start World War III." Instead, the British had to feed and water the Russians. The short 2008 war with Georgia also exposed Russian deficiencies. Putin then poured money into the defense budget, including new equipment, for example the Armata main battle tank that was said to be the best in the world. Their operations in Ukraine and Syria indicated that Russia's forces were now perhaps somewhat more capable. They also modernized their precision-guided weapons and their command and control systems. The revitalized Russian forces had fought weak opponents in Georgia. The Ukrainian forces, who fought in 2014 to 15, were poorly trained, ill-armed and demoralized. The Syrian rebels, both Islamist and more secular, had often fought with determination, but they did not possess an air force, navy, or advanced land warfare systems. The strategic thinking in the Obama White House was channeled through the prism of Russia's ailing economy that was further enfeebled by Western sanctions and the inevitably temporary drop in the oil price. Putin's military bravado was perceived as a front to rally domestic support in a country going down the economic tubes. As Barack Obama put it, Putin was pursuing 19th-century politics with 20th-century weapons in the 21st century. Russia had given up on integrating with the West. Moscow would focus on the post-Soviet Eurasia. Strategic ties with China would be built up, while Western influence would be minimized. This trend was exacerbated when general economic sanctions imposed by the EU and America were tightened to include specific companies linked to Putin's inner circle. Tensions grew with the West over more than sanctions. In Syria, both Russian and American militaries tried to manage deconfliction of aircraft. Nobody wanted accidental superpower dogfights. In Europe, aerial brinkmanship was reaching dangerous levels. Russian warplanes were constantly buzzing Western jets, both civilian and military. One of the most serious incidents happened on the 7th of April 2015. A Russian Su-27, NATO designation flanker, flew very close to an American RC-135 reconnaissance plane in international airspace over the Baltic Sea. Washington went through diplomatic and intelligence channels to complain about the highly unsafe behavior, but Moscow said the American aircraft had been flying with its identifying transponder turned off. Shooting down of planes could have led to accidental war between Russia and NATO. Yet some coordination over Syria and attempted peace talks and occasional truces, as well as airspace management, meant that both Washington and Moscow had to talk sometimes. Even more crucially, the two adversaries continued to work on constraining Iran's nuclear aspirations. Also, Washington still needed Russian rockets, not just to send Western astronauts to the International Space Station, but also, it was not played up in the media, to launch American military satellites. The US would eventually build its own rockets again, but it was cheaper to use Russia's aging, though reliable rockets. It suited big financial interests in both countries to maintain this eccentric connection. Putin continued to rail against the West not just over sanctions, but also for failing to stop the Islamic State, and sometimes even to blame Washington for instigating Islamist opposition to President Assad of Syria. Most sensitive to the ex-KGB colonel was the threat from Europe. From Putin's historical perspective, NATO was a capitalistic tool that was starting to occupy too much of Moscow's near abroad. Putin warned that sanctions were part of the policy of containment, which has been carried out against our country for many years, always, for decades, if not centuries. In short, whenever someone thinks that Russia has become too strong or independent, these tools are quickly put into use. Putin deployed the Fortress Russia argument to bolster his own popularity. Defending the Russian people in neighbouring states, especially in Ukraine, galvanized domestic support in Russia. The return to the homeland of Crimea was especially popular among ordinary Russians. Even Gorbachev, a big critic of Putin, called it a happy event. The Crimean Peninsula had been formally annexed in 1783, after the hated Ottomans had been defeated in battle. It had been given to Kiev in 1954 as a token gesture by President Khrushchev to celebrate Ukraine's integration into Russia 300 years before. The defense of Russians and Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine was a big crowd-pleaser inside Russia. According to opinion polls, not all government-sponsored, Putin's rating averaged around 85%, a figure that Western politicians could only dream about. The decline in living standards, partly caused by sanctions, appeared not to influence the president's poll ratings very much. Around 14% of Russians thought that the government should take measures to get them lifted. Regular majorities in polls showed that the EU, and especially America, were considered hostile and deploying a variety of propaganda and physical threats. For example, the sporting bans on Russian athletes because of doping were considered the West's own brand of hybrid warfare. If not sending sportspeople to the Rio Olympics was a blow to Russian prestige, the geopolitical threat was still paramount. The West simply failed fully to comprehend that dangling EU membership in front of Kiev was seen as an inevitable precursor.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?